Thank you all for being here. I'm Shayna Strom. I'm the president and CEO at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. Equitable Growth is a nonprofit research and grant-making organization whose mission is to connect economic evidence and policy to promote shared prosperity and growth. Today's conversation on tariffs is especially timely. The recent Supreme Court ruling overturning President Trump's tariffs was significant, but the White House has signaled it intends to keep them in place under different authorities. That means that the impacts on jobs, prices, and economic growth not only isn't going away, they're getting even more confusing. Whether you're advising policymakers or doing your own research, our goal today is to help you make sense amid this economic uncertainty. That's why we've brought together leading economists and policy experts to walk us through what the evidence actually shows and leave you with new tools for your own analysis. Before I hand it over, I would like to take a moment to thank everyone from the Equitable Growth team who made today's event possible, and to our experts for joining us to make sense of evidence. And of course, thank you to everyone in the audience today for joining us and for all that you're doing in your own work to inform sound policy and business decisions. With that, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Chris Bangert-Drowns, to introduce his novel data set on industry-level tariff costs before we dive into the panel discussion. Chris?
Thank you, Shanna, for that introduction, and thank you all in attendance today. Of course, thank you to our great panelists who we'll be hearing from shortly. I want to take the next 10 minutes or so to briefly discuss Equitable Growth's tariff project. Questions about that project can be submitted to the Q&A Zoom function here, and we'll address one or two at the end, or you can email me directly. I'd be more than happy to correspond with anybody on this call about this really interesting project. So this morning, Equitable Growth published an updated set of findings building on work that we did last year to estimate tariff impacts by industry, focusing specifically on input costs. We think this approach can help policymakers, journalists, and researchers parse the complex effects of a very complicated policy environment. I'll discuss our methods in a little more detail in a moment. There's a lot more detail in the report that we published this morning, so do take a peek if you're interested. But first, I wanted to share a few top-level findings. This chart on the screen right here is just an example of one of the many kinds of data visualizations that can be produced from Equitable Growth's tariff data project. This chart specifically shows monthly estimated tariff rates paid on imported inputs by U.S. economic sector. Each line represents a different sector, with some important sectors highlighted. You can see construction, manufacturing, mining, and extractive industries there. There are three key takeaways. First, almost every U.S. economic sector experienced 2 rounds of tariff growth last year, in some cases explosive tariff growth. That first phase was in the late spring to early summer, as the first round of country-specific IEEPA tariffs came into effect, and then a second round in the late summer to early fall, when some commodity-specific tariffs under Section 232, Section 301 came into effect. So broadly speaking, there was this explosion of tariff costs over the course of the year. But two, there is significant variation in those tariff costs between U.S. sectors, and we'll talk more about why there is this significant variation. Third takeaway here is, of course, that the most impacted sectors, the ones highlighted in this chart, are key upstream sectors in the U.S. economy. These are important sectors because they're large employers. There are over 20 million workers in construction and manufacturing alone, and they supply important services and inputs to much of the rest of the U.S. economy. So in other words, tariff-related decisions by firms in these industries, in these impacted industries, could have meaningful impacts for workers and downstream businesses and consumers. I'll briefly mention here, and again, there's more detail in the report this morning, but our project produces a few different kinds of measures for assessing tariff impact by sector. We've been looking at this chart at estimated tariff rates, which are simply a sector's estimated tariff bill as a fraction of the value of their imports. Another metric takes that estimated tariff bill and looks at it as a fraction of all inputs, not just imported inputs. The secondary measure, I think, is a more accurate view of total tariff costs and is illustrative here with the manufacturing sector, where manufacturing, as you can see in this chart, pays about, on average, the 6th or 7th highest tariff rate out of all U.S. economic sectors. But manufacturing as a whole imports a greater share of the total value of its inputs than any other U.S. sector. So when you combine tariff rates with import shares, we find manufacturing actually is the most impacted sector in the US economy. One of the most important features of this project is the ability to link sector or industry tariff costs, like we were just looking at, with industry employment to help policymakers, journalists, researchers identify geographic areas where tariff impacts could be particularly pronounced. This map shows this capability. Our data project produces a metric shown here called the Employment Exposure Score. This combines an industry's estimated tariff exposure, which we were looking at, with its importance to the economy of a particular area, measured in terms of the fraction of employment in that industry relative to employment in that area. This metric is useful to compare between geographic areas. So, for example, in this chart, if a state has an exposure score of 4, it's about half as tariff exposed as a state with a score of 8. Of course, this map shows state-level employment exposure scores, but our data allow for this kind of analysis at the county level as well. And I'd again invite folks to read the report that we published this morning, where we go into significant detail about the capability of that county level analysis. At the state level, we can see some broad regional patterns here, with Midwestern and Southern states on average facing higher tariff exposure than some Northeastern or Mid-Atlantic states. Michigan and Indiana, highlighted here in orange, are clearly outliers relative even to the group of already highly tariff exposed states, which are colored in that dark blue or black color. And this particular uh, outlier states are due to large shares of state employment in manufacturing, as one might expect, particularly in auto body manufacturing, and some related industries like machine shops. And it's worth saying here that there are some political implications. They're probably self-evident, but the last few presidential election cycles have been determined by just a handful of votes in a few states, including some of the Midwestern states that this chart shows to be relatively highly tariff impacted. So tariff politics could play out in interesting ways. And while we don't perform this analysis at the congressional district level, our county level analysis has been of great interest to congressional staff and offices. And again, I'd encourage folks to reach out to myself. Again, you can find my contact information online. I'll present it again at the end of the slides. Please do reach out. I'd be more than happy to correspond and work with your office about how to understand tariff impacts in your area. So we've been discussing this geographic granularity that's capable in our data, but it's also complemented by additional industrial granularity. At the top of this presentation, we discussed tariff costs for broad sectors, manufacturing, construction, mining, extractive industries. But our data allow us to zoom in at the subsector and at the industry level. For example, we can see significant variation here in tariff costs within the manufacturing sector. This is a chart breaking the manufacturing sector into independent subsectors. And you can see significant variation between machinery at the very top and petroleum and coal products at the very bottom. And the report goes into more detail about this variation. We can go even further, and this is a new capability. This update that we released this morning builds on last year's work by letting us zoom in from the subsector level to the industry level. This chart uses the primary and fabricated metals subsectors as an example, but we can do this for the auto sector, we can do this for machinery sector, and we do this in the report. So again, I'd invite folks to read that. I want to emphasize briefly here the stark difference in costs between iron and steel mills, this dark purple line at the very bottom, and steel products from purchased steel, this lighter purple line at the very top. I think it's illustrative of the ways that this data can speak to tariff incidents and point towards directions that industries can take to lower their tariff incidents. These two sectors, steel products from purchased steel and iron and steel mills separately, produce similar types of products, but have significantly different input profiles. And really, it boils down to the use of scrap metal. Scrap metal has a significant domestic supply, but when it is imported, it's imported at a low tariff rate. Iron and steel mills use scrap at a far higher rate than steel products from purchased steel, about 4 or 5 times as much, in fact, as a portion of their total inputs. And this speaks to not only one, the variation in commodity profiles between industries that this data can reveal, but it also speaks in this example to how the domestication of supply chains is in fact incentivized by tariff policy. We can see here the use of domestic scrap metal is benefiting relatively the iron and steel industry relative to steel products from purchased steel. I want to close by emphasizing some limitations and strengths of our project. First, as I mentioned at the top, this project focuses on how tariffs affect input costs across US industries. This project does not address competitive advantages potentially gained by domestic industry when tariffs are imposed on competitor imports, nor does the project address competitive disadvantages due to retaliatory tariffs imposed on our exports to trading partners. So again, we're focused on input costs here. Second, this update estimates industry tariff costs using real effective rates calculated at the commodity level from US ITC data. This is a crucial update. I don't want to spend too much time getting into the weeds on it, but we know from research that statutory rates have been persistently higher than real effective rates paid at ports. And so we know that using real effective rates can provide a more accurate estimate of industry tariff costs. Lastly, and perhaps most importantly for researchers in attendance, the raw data and Stata code that we've used in this project are available on the Equitable Growth GitHub. You can find that GitHub link at the very bottom of the report that we published this morning. The data is very rich. This visual that's up on the screen right now, I don't want to get into details about, but it's one of the many kinds of data visualizations that can be produced from our data. I'd invite anybody who's interested, if you're a policymaker, a journalist, a researcher, or just a member of the public, please reach out. My email is there. I want to correspond and collaborate. There's a lot of opportunities for future research using this novel data set. With that, I want to pass this off to Josh Boak, our AP journalist, who's here to moderate a really stellar panel and help us discuss the fiscal, macroeconomic, and labor market effects of tariff policy.
Thanks so much for that, Chris. And what a fascinating issue for a Tuesday. This is a complicated and nuanced set of challenges and opportunities for the U.S. economy. And we have a really fascinating panel to discuss what's going on and what might be coming in the future. Elena Patel is at Brookings, and she's the co-director of the Urban Brookings Tax Policy Center. And in fact, today she co-authored a really great look at the fiscal impact of Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill. Carola Binder is at the University of Texas, Austin, their School of Civic Leadership, and she wrote a great book in 2024, Shock Values, Price and Inflation in American Democracy. And Riley Olson is with the AFL-CIO, but I've been familiar with the work he's done since he was at the Alliance for American Manufacturing. And I guess kind of the simple way to think about all of this is to say that President Donald Trump has made several promises about what tariffs can achieve. He says that they will bring in foreign investment, that will create factory jobs, that will lower the trade imbalance, and that will also then create the revenues to reduce the budget deficit. And Elena, I was curious, right now they're looking to replace the IEEPA tariffs with these 301 investigations. Are those reliable sources of income that can make a difference in the federal budget deficit? How should we think about how this tool is being used to fund the government?
That's a good question. Yes, so the IEEPA tariffs were overturned on February 20th, and we heard from the administration almost immediately that they were confident that they could replace the tariffs that had been in place through IEEPA by using other trade authorities, one of which is the Section 301 investigation. Section 301 exists to allow USTR to investigate unfair trade practices that might be in place in other countries, and then give the USTR the leverage and the tools to be able to protect US manufacturers and industry from these unfair trade practices. It's a long-standing trade authority that exists. We have used it sparingly in the past. And one would say I have no doubt that the IEEPA can be the revenue, and the tariffs that have been in place can probably be fully implemented through Section 301 Just to give you a sense of scope, there are 76 of these investigations that are currently underway, and we expect more of them to be coming down the pike, given what has been said by the administration. Can this solve our deficit problem? The answer is probably not. And that's in part because we are running a structural deficit right now. That's about 2% of GDP. And so even when the full IEEPA tariff was in place, CBO estimated that $3 trillion in new revenue could come in. But I want you to keep in mind that the only way to raise revenue through a tariff is to still have imports coming into the country. If we raise tariffs so high so as to protect manufacturing and revitalize US manufacturing, I think the idea is to shrink the number of imports, which erodes the tax base. And also the rates that were in place through February 20th, as Chris has been talking about and underlies all of the great work that they've done, they were historically high rates. And what will go in place with 301 may replace the revenue, but the rates that are going to come out of that could look quite different than what happened through IEEPA. IEEPA just imposed broad tariffs that were very flexible, that could be adjusted by the president as quickly as he wanted, country by country. 301 is a much slower, it's a much more regimented process, and they'll start to layer these 301s for forced labor practices, for excess manufacturing. They have a number of reasons that they'll be layering these that could result, truthfully, in a completely different sector and input specific tariff rate than what we had that was under IEEPA. So I would still say it's highly uncertain, but I wouldn't doubt their ability to put similarly sized trade barriers in place through the 301 process.
And just to check, those 301s would likely, in some form, the investigations would go into effect at the end of July.
So the 301 process is actually a pretty tight timeline. And so they are open for public comment right now. There'll be hearings, I think, in the first week of May. And then on the other side of those public hearings, the USTR has some time to put the remedy in place once they've made a ruling based on their investigation of unfair trade practices. So by July, many of these could be done because they're using a very accelerated timeline right now. The last go around, it took months and months and sometimes years to get 301 investigations done, but they have a different motivation potentially right now to get these done quite quickly.
And just to check, even if those 301s were put in place, they would still face legal challenges. So this could ultimately still be a court issue.
So the 301s, and I should put an asterisk, I'm an economist and not a lawyer, so I don't like to wade into law as much as I can avoid it. However, the 301 process is quite regulated, actually. And so I personally am not worried about the legality of the 301. There certainly may be court challenges on the back end of some of those going in place. What I think is unclear right now, and in fact, there's a lawsuit that's moving through the system, is the Section 122 Band-Aid that has been put in place to get us from IEEPA, I think, into the fully phased in 301 tariffs. And so there are questions about the legality of the 122 10% tariff rates that were put in immediately on the back end of IEEPA being overturned. And that's where, to your point about revenue, that's where the asterisk is. There's $200 billion right now that is in question about how this is going to be refunded and to whom it's going to be refunded, which is a really complicated question. One can think of all of the 122 tariffs that are being collected now, and in principle, will be turned off when the 301s are in place. Those also probably, those revenue dollars will have an asterisk on them while the legality of 122, it works its way through the courts.
Gotcha. Carola, one of the things that came up after Liberation Day was tremendous amount of fear about the U.S. economy and whether we'd be burdened by inflation. And I'm curious, for coming out of that experience, why were kind of the most apocalyptic predictions wrong, and what does that tell us about the current situation going forward?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, as you mentioned, policy uncertainty is extremely high right now. There is a measure of economic policy uncertainty by Baker, Bloom, and Davis, and around Liberation Day, it spiked to an all-time high. Since then, it's fallen, but now it's rising again, close to those COVID levels. Policy uncertainty in general acts as it reduces aggregate demand. So that actually has a tendency to be deflationary or disinflationary, while which goes in the opposite effect of the adverse supply consequences of the tariffs, which tend to be inflationary. So kind of on net, those inflationary impacts were relatively modest. what might happen right now, though, we're seeing inflation expectations that they're going to rise so much because of the Iran situation and the higher oil and gas prices. And so it's going to make it really hard for monetary policymakers to know what to do about these tariffs. Usually the best monetary policy response is kind of to look through supply shocks like tariffs. But if they're concerned about inflation expectations becoming unanchored, then they might have to respond by raising interest rates, which would have pretty bad consequences for the real economy. They didn't have to do that yet, but now we have this combination of the tariffs and the gas prices. So I imagine that's going to become more of a problem. But yeah, I mean, the US economy did turn out to be pretty resilient. I think a lot of the negative consequences are kind of counteracted by the fiscal stimulus and also by AI investment and others like that. So that's maybe why the adverse consequences, even though they were there, were not as catastrophic as people were expecting a year or two ago.
And I'm curious, when you look at the situation, not just with Iran, but for the choice that the Fed has to make on rates. We've
Mhm.
seen the 10-year US Treasury go up since the fighting in Iran began. Um, what is the Fed's fundamental choice given its dual mandate in this environment with kind of the new tariff regime coming?
Yeah, with the dual mandate, whenever you have adverse supply shocks, you always have the trade-off between the employment side and the price stability side, right? The Fed monetary policy is aggregate demand policy. It can either cut interest rates, loosen policy, and that's going to raise prices and boost employment, or it can do the opposite. It can't handle something like an oil price shock or a tariff shock if it's on the supply side, if it's like raising unemployment and raising inflation, the Fed does not have a good option there. That's why normally they would look through it. But when it's not clear cut, how long the shock will last or what combination of shocks are hitting the economy, it's harder for the Fed to know how much to respond.
Riley, labor unions have historically looked at tariffs as ways to address unfair advantages that foreign competitors might have through their own policy choices. Do you see those tariffs as doing that? And do you see the tariffs as meaningfully adding to manufacturing, to adding jobs?
Thank you for that question again. Thanks for glad to be here with everyone. I think the challenge is, and break out your tiny violin for me, is I get to try to inject nuance into an incredibly polarized environment. I think the question, if you're looking at sectoral-based tariffs, you're looking at tariffs where there have been investigations looking at actual unfair trade practices. It's a very different picture than if you're looking at these broader-based IEEPA tariffs. So things like the Section 232 on steel and aluminum, things like the Section 232 on auto and auto parts, as well as heavy duty truck, places where there is a base here, where there is idle capacity. We do see positive outcomes. But unfortunately, for a lot of other sectors, tariffs need to be paired. They need to be strategic. They need to be thoughtful. They need to be paired with industrial policy. And we've seen cuts going the other direction, which has undermined any kind of effectiveness these would have. But again, I would say to the broader question, I think what people see in the media, the IEEPA tariffs, now Section 122, the lack of targeting there has been a challenge for us. And I would say there are even specific instances like with Canada where we have outright opposed the tariffs. We have sent letters. We have multiple affiliates who have done it because we see directly into the supply chains and how the back and forth there is being impacted. And so I have to give the yes and no answer, but I think to the broader picture, I think there's a lot of alignment because the uncertainty that Carol and Elena referenced is a real challenge for our folks.
And when you say uncertainty, help people who aren't like deep in this. What do you mean by that? What is the drag that the uncertainty creates? Why does that emotion matter so much?
Yeah, well, I think in terms of investment decisions, it's really hard to. I mean, it's a little easier to get a line started up again, but you're not going to reline a blast furnace at a steel mill if the tariff could change in the next 3 months or 3 weeks or 3 days. And so I think things that are more durable, things where there's been an investigation, where there's some precedent, like the steel and aluminum tariffs, like the autos, that allows for the kind of investments we've seen by GM, by Stellantis. But in places like IEEPA, where these deals are being cut, the tariff rates are changing, it's a lot harder to contemplate a greenfield in that environment, a greenfield investment, excuse me.
Gotcha. Now, Chris, so much of your research has shown that tariffs have real costs that are being borne by companies. And I'm curious for where you hope to look next in this environment, because you had an administration that specifically said that the tariffs would not be borne by U.S. consumers or domestic companies, but by foreign enterprises.
Yeah, I think research has shown that most of the tariff costs being faced by businesses are being passed down to their business clients or to consumers. We have Fed research that shows this. I think for our work, there are a few ways to take this. I think, I mentioned that our work focuses specifically on input costs. I'm interested in working methodologically to figure out, is there a way we can find a sort of dollar value estimate of the benefits, the competitive advantages to sectors that are facing competitor imports. And so tariffs on those final goods could potentially benefit domestic industries, offsetting those additional costs. Now, Riley was making the point that there's sort of, in some cases, a longer term effect for those competitive advantages. And so in some instances, we're going to see short-term costs pile up. And then I think some businesses who have the ability to weather that short-term storm can look to invest in the future, which gets to a second avenue for further building out this equitable growth tariff project, which is, I think there's good evidence, anecdotal at least, that suggests that the impacts of tariffs differs a lot between large businesses and small businesses. Large businesses have oftentimes in-house compliance teams that can address the complexity of tariff policy. They have diversified businesses where certain segments might be harmed by tariffs while others might benefit. And so they can shift resources internally towards segments of the businesses that are hurt less or in fact helped by tariffs. And small businesses don't have the same margins as large businesses to absorb these sort of short-term costs before potential competitive advantages come into play. And so those are two of the ways that I envision building out Equitable Growth's data project more, is by trying to assess the competitive advantages in a dollar value to compare that to the costs, but then also look at the difference in impacts between large and small businesses.
So the large and small impact seems important. And it's one that's overlooked because it's driven by this interesting phenomenon in which most manufacturing workers work for large companies, but like 98% of manufacturing establishments have 200 or fewer employees. So would the expectation be that if smaller companies had to absorb these, you might have fewer manufacturing establishments in the US?
That's possible. It's one of the things that we want to test. I don't want to make any sort of empirical assessment right now, but that is certainly one of the, I think there's a few different labor market metrics that we'd want to test here. So one would be the number of firms, and by size also would be the number of workers. And then also, of course, what's the impact on wages here? And so from a theoretical perspective, one could imagine that as a business is facing increased input costs and capital costs, they might want to contain labor costs as well, and that could lead to wage suppression. And so there's a few different, and again, I'm not making that claim right now that there is wage suppression, but it's one of the things that we want to test with this data set looking forward, is impacts on labor markets by number of firms, number of employees, and wage growth.
And I'm curious, in your work, what's going on with Georgia? And I say that because Georgia is one of the states that's added manufacturing jobs under Trump, but at the same time, your research indicates it's kind of less exposed to tariff inputs. So if tariffs were actually creating the jobs, then one would assume that increased exposure might not necessarily be bad, but maybe.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, Georgia's one of the sort of average affected states. It's about middle of the pack. But when you split Georgia up by industry and by county, there are certainly hotspots there as well. And there is significant employment in manufacturing and construction in Georgia. So those are, it's certainly worth flagging. I think it's important to understand that tariffs don't exist in a vacuum here, right? There are countervailing forces We're seeing an explosion in data center construction that is benefiting jobs in construction just at the same time as construction is facing these increased input costs. And with manufacturing similarly too. I mean, there are uh, areas outside of tariffs that can positively benefit employment growth in manufacturing that could help offset the costs of tariffs here. I think it's also worth noting that we've seen in the last several decades, and Riley can speak much more to this than I could. We've seen a movement in manufacturing within the United States from traditional strongholds in the Midwest to the South, where law is often stacked against labor unions and against workers, makes it easier for employers to exploit workers. So it's not unsurprising that if there is, employment growth in the United States, that it occurs in these states where historically there's been a movement from jobs into these less worker-friendly states. But again, I just want to say, there are many complex factors impacting in manufacturing employment, not just tariffs, and so it's important to assess all of those factors altogether.
Much more broadly, and I throw it open to everyone, have these tariffs made the U.S. manufacturing sector more competitive with China or any other international competitor? Do we see any evidence that they're delivering on that?
I would just say that I think that that question would be, even under the best of circumstances, very hard to speak to so soon after this. And given the volatility of the tariffs and how they're implemented and when and how they change, I mean, for me, I wouldn't be looking for evidence that this is helping manufacturing for months or years into the future, which is worth noting because you could imagine that maybe isn't on the timeline that this administration has in mind in terms of trying to make headway, if that's the goal, in a revival of US manufacturing. Of the kinds of investments we're talking about, those are long run, large fixed investments that, they take years of planning, and we just haven't had that much time pass yet.
I would just second that. I think in addition to just the time frame, the amount of noise from the gutting of the Inflation Reduction Act and what the impact that will have on construction jobs and manufacturing, I think we're still trying to understand how to disaggregate that. So I would just second Elena's point there because there's so much going on right now. It's really difficult to tell.
Has the U.S. economy gotten $18 trillion in new investment commitments, as President Trump has claimed? Do we see evidence of that in the macro data?
I don't think so. I think it's, again, a bit early to tell, but I don't think so.
Everyone's nodding their head, so that seems like universal agreement.
Yeah. I would also perhaps mention here that I think in some instances, when somebody's claimed that they've made a move because of tariffs, it might, and this is true also with AI, where oftentimes we've seen layoffs being excused by AI when it might just be a normal course of business. And so I think that, the Stellantis example that Riley brought up is interesting here because it was clearly happened after tariffs were imposed. If you ask the CEO of Stellantis whether this was directly due to tariffs, his public statements have kind of waffled on it. It seems like it's it'll certainly benefit the tariff picture for Stellantis, but he's also implied that this is an investment that they would have made anyway or would have considered making anyway because of the benefit in terms of having an American footprint. So I think, again, it's to Riley's point, there's a lot of noise, and I think part of that noise is the sort of way that people talk about decisions, whether they're tariff related in fact or not.
And I would just say, just to be completely fair to this administration, like the counting of investment dollars associated with particular initiatives is not a thing the Trump administration invented. The Biden administration certainly did this with regards to the CHIPS Act of trying to count investment dollars associated with their signature legislation. And I don't think anybody necessarily is trying to do something wrong. I just think it's very hard, again, for these deals that often are months or years in the making to say, yes, this one is because of chips or that one is because of the IEEPA tariffs. And you can understand the incentive to start counting things in the ledger that you would like it to show up in. But the truth is, actually saying this is because of policy X or tariff Y is quite difficult.
So let me push on that a little bit, right?
Yep.
Because obviously we saw in the lead up to chips an increase in construction spending
Yes.
in the manufacturing sector. So the correlation there seems pretty clear.
Yeah.
We've seen a slowdown in construction spending in this era. And I'm curious, basically, is it possible to revive manufacturing if you are relying more on sticks than on carrots? The stick in this case being tariffs, and the carrots being things like the Inflation Reduction Act and CHIPS, which were both Biden era programs.
If I could, I wouldn't give one or the other an advantage. I think, we've seen it work both ways. In the Obama administration, there's a tremendous amount of investment in clean energy through tax credits.
Mhm.
There was very much an expected boom in manufacturing, and that was all almost all replaced by dumped Chinese imports. We actually saw manufacturing go down somehow, even as installations shot through the roof. And then, so I think you need both sides of it, and I think without both, it's simply not going to work in the long term.
And I would just say this is again some of the like regular course of action for the trade authorities that have been right now kind of stretched and manipulated, I think, to get to a particular aggregate trade policy that the administration is aiming for. But exactly what Riley just said, like imports that are being dumped at a moment when US manufacturers are investing, that's what, for example, Section 232 protections are supposed to be there for. And they should be used in those cases in very like limited and temporary ways to offset these sort of anti-trade practices of other countries. And in terms of carrots and sticks, again, I think it is simplest to think of the US in isolation, but we have to recognize that the US is one of several large economies, each with their own manufacturing sectors, and US manufacturers are competing against manufacturers in other settings that themselves have their own carrots and sticks. And in some sense, it's one global market. And I think each economy and each government is trying to best position their own manufacturers in a quite complex game, so to speak. And so I think that that means that it shouldn't be surprising that sometimes both carrots and sticks work because we're talking about really complicated, very integrated manufacturing and supply chains.
I'm curious, in a practical sense, what are some of the data sets or data sources or economic tools that you use to figure out what's actually going on here so that people don't get lost in the anecdotes or the hype? What's some practical things that people can look to?
I mean, I think it's old fashioned, but aggregate macro data series do not lie. And so some of what you're referencing with, a boom in construction that we see at moments that correlate with pieces of legislation, I do think that those are informative in the debate and recognizing that these things are happening in conjunction with complex background macroeconomic forces that Carola can speak much better about than me, is recognizing that there is no silver bullet data set that's going to identify the manufacturing that is coming to the US because of tariffs. But I think aggregate macro series are as useful as they've ever been, because if somebody's telling you a story that there's a construction boom, you should be able to see it in those data. And so if you don't, that should be a red flag that I'm not quite sure what the data is that you are telling me is telling the story that you think it is.
Any other data sources you guys like?
Yeah,
I
I
mean,
mean, I
there are
can.
so many. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Carola.
Oh, there are so many different measures of inflation that you can look at these days, various versions of core inflation that would strip out different kinds of noise. So the different regional feds provide different ones, trimmed mean, trimmed median. Just you can or just go to the BLS website and see inflation in different categories of goods. Um, but if they're all roughly in line, that's telling you a stronger story than if just one particular selected inflation measure is high. You want to see evidence from a variety of them.
And going back to this point that I made in my report or in the presentation at the top about the difference between statutory rates and real effective rates, I want to emphasize this again, right? We've seen researchers shown that the rates as set by policy and as announced by the White House appear to be persistently higher than the tariff rates actually paid at ports of entry. And this persistent gap, it's not clear entirely why it exists. I mean, it's some combination of evasion. And avoidance, right? And similarly with the tax environment, we see this with large taxpayers engaging in avoidance techniques. This could be happening with tariffs as well. But regardless of whatever the reason is for this gap between statutory rates and real effective rates, it's important to use to pitch our data project again. It's important to use accurate data about effective rates as they're paid at ports of entry. And so our data project makes that improvement, right? So last year, our project was using statutory rates to make prospective assessments about industry level tariff rates. What we're doing now in this data project is doing retrospective looks using real effective rates directly calculated from US ITC data, just basically saying here's what for each commodity, here's what your duties were paid, here's what your customs value were. You make that division, that's the effective tariff rate on that commodity. And so there you can get a lot of granularity in that US ITC data. It's a little bit in the weeds, but again, given this persistent gap between statutory rates and real effective rates, that kind of data set is crucial for measuring the real effective tariffs.
I want to remind everyone, if you have any questions for our panelists, feel free to ask them anytime using the Q&A box. Be sure to include your primary affiliation along with your question. For the group in general, tariffs have gotten a lot of attention, but what outstanding issues do you think aren't getting enough emphasis going forward that maybe you think the media or policymakers are overlooking?
Well, this may
I
not.
could offer
Oh, go
one.
ahead, Elena.
Oh, go ahead.
No,
I'll
go
just
ahead.
start with, I can't say this enough, so anytime anybody gives me a chance to make this point, I'd like to make it. We are asking a lot in terms of the administrative capacity of the federal government right now, both with lifting up tariffs, with enforcing tariffs, now with possibly processing refunds, and in the context of major tax reform last summer. And I don't think that policymakers quite appreciate the burden that they're putting on federal agencies to make sure that all of the tariffs that are supposed to be collected are collected correctly, and et cetera. And so I think there's a really important case to be made always, and especially right now, for making sure that those agencies have all of the resources and support that they need to, if we're a country with large tariff rates on a going forward basis, to make sure that those tariffs are implemented exactly as they're supposed to be and are as easy for small businesses, as we've talked about, to be able to interact with the system easily and simply without creating extra burden. And so I would just say that an overlooked piece of this is how underfunded the administrative capacity of the federal government is right now to be able to support these kinds of policies.
Yeah, historically, tariffs are among the most polarizing kind of economic policy that can be implemented. They open the door to all kinds of rent seeking because they're allowing historically Congress, but now the president, to pick winners and losers. They're going to cause even more polarization, partisanship than we already have. Like Elena said, they require so much administrative capacity. So that's a cost of tariffs, right? They have high costs for American governance, for people's for the government's credibility, people's trust in the government, especially when they're just imposed by the president instead of by Congress.
I would just add how the tariffs play into the affordability argument. It'll probably come as no surprise coming from the AFL-CIO, but I think we spend far too much time on the cost side and not enough on the wages. That is a huge piece, how wages have not kept up with productivity. And I'm looking forward to future conversation with Chris, because I think one of the things that we have seen is how trade has been used to actually suppress wages. We see it when workers try to form a union, they are threatened with closure. There was a study done immediately after, a few years after NAFTA, looking at how closure rates increased after certification. We see it at the bargaining table. When workers ask to get their fair share, they're told to take what they can get, what the company's willing to offer, or they'll move offshore. And so we've seen a real way in which that is suppressed wages for our workers. And so again, when tariffs are strategically applied, they can remove some of that credible threat of offshoring. But again, want to make sure that it's very clear that it's strategic, that is industry specific with a plan.
We do have a question from Emily Ruskin at EG, who asks, after all this disruption in the tariff regime, what would a sound trade agenda look like moving forward? And what would your recommendations be to lawmakers?
I might just
I'm
emphasize that
happy. Oh, go ahead, Chris.
I would just say at the very top, we've all talked about uncertainty. I think certainty is very important here. Even if the choice is to go with some sort of overarching, very broad, very historically massive tariff regime, keeping it in place would at least give certainty to businesses to respond to it. So I think, and legally that might mean Congress trying to actually pull back some power here and say this cannot be just policy that the president sets. We need to have more tariff setting authority in Congress. But I think by and large, certainty has to be core to the tariff project.
I will tell you that on a going forward basis, what I worry a lot about, and I've echoed this a little bit, and Riley, I think, has spoken to this as well, is those trade acts exist for a reason. And the more that they are stretched and distorted to achieve some different goal, I think undermines their ability to be used in a useful way going forward, again, to protect US manufacturers from dumping and to really directly address unfair trade practices to the extent that Section 301 is appropriate. So I worry on the other side of this when the 301s, I would hope eventually are wound down by some next administration, how we sort of regain credibility with those trade tools, because they are an important part of the administration's toolkit. And the more that they're used inappropriately, the harder it is to use them, I think, in a valid way on a going forward basis.
Yeah, tariffs are not a good tool for macroeconomic policy. They might have some purposes for unfair trade practices, but we shouldn't think, I mean, you can go back to Adam Smith, right? We're not mercantilists here. The macroeconomic goal is not to reduce the trade deficit. Tariffs are not what we want to be doing for macroeconomic policy purposes.
I'll just add, it's probably clear that that question has informed every one of my answers so far, Josh, so thank you for it. I think our big fear is that the backlash to this current approach will be to go back to business as usual, which was a complete disaster. And the way we see it actually drove a lot of the polarization because of the amount of deindustrialization we saw across communities where our members work and live. And so for us, it's, again, targeted towards places where there's idle capacity, paired with very thoughtful strategic industrial policy, investments in our workers, and again, a plan that people can see and follow so there's certainty.
And let me pick up on that because this is actually related but somewhat different. When you talk about investment in workers, what do you mean by that? And what's the gap between what should be done versus what is being done? Because I hear every administration talk up apprenticeships, that kind of thing, and yet there's a gap between the rhetoric and the money.
So I can jump in first. I think there's three pieces to it. So of course there's workforce development. We absolutely need to see that increase both public as well as private side. But it's also grants and loans to stand up capacity when we do have a plan to reshore or to create a new industry. We're at a time where there's a lot of industries that can leapfrog. And then also demand, figure out ways for demand pulls as well to help stand up. And you need to do all three of those things, I think, to be successful.
One of the things you pointed out in your answer, Elena, was that you stressed the idea that if the 301s or 232's purpose gets distorted too much, could you spell out kind of, not so much asking you to make a prediction, what is the risk of this going forward if the distortions become too great?
I think the risk is that, again, when these are used in a targeted way, they can protect certain sectors from dumping, for example. I think that's a really clear case of what 232 is there to do, is to protect certain manufacturers from dumping. With that in mind, if you start, and so 232, I think, truthfully, is a little bit separate from 301. 232 is, I think, so far, with the exception of kitchen cabinets and vanities, which I might argue don't necessarily tie into a national security strategy in a way that's has a lot of clear line of sight. The 301 with the unfair trade practices, that what's happened right now is a deluge. And so where in the past 8 years across Trump V1 and then the Biden administration, which was very limited use of 301 for very particular concerns related to China, so a single 301 investigation, we have 76 of them right now. And 16 of them are overlapping, where whole economies are subject to 301 investigations, both for excess manufacturing capacity and for the fact that they import inputs that come from China. And so lambasting Canada, for example, for not doing enough to protect workers in China. And I just think that as a trade tool, I can't think of how that's a terribly effective diplomatic strategy. And so I think it becomes quite clear that what they're trying to do, and they've said this, is simply replace the IEEPA tariffs with different authorities to layer back up to the top IEEPA rates that they had before. And so that, to me, I think weakens the credibility of the United States in trying to combat something that really is a problem, which is forced labor practices in other economies. And to the extent we latch on to those to achieve other goals, which really is revitalizing manufacturing in the United States, we conflate those two things. And I think that makes it hard for the US to be a leader on what can be some really important issues by shoveling everything into this 301 process. That's what I worry about. And I think it's more philosophical than it is practical, but it's hard to be a leader in an area when it becomes clear that, you know, it's a means to an end rather than an investigation about a particular concerning trade practice from a particular economy.
Maria Monroe asks a question for you, Carola, about the negative forecasts that haven't happened yet, but is there a reason to believe that kind of those negative drags could happen in the future if the US stays on this path?
What I could see happening is if the combination of tariffs and high oil prices lead the Fed to be concerned that inflation expectations are becoming unanchored and they feel the need to tighten policy, which a couple of recent Fed speeches have indicated that they view inflation as becoming more of a problem than the labor market at the moment. So that would, you know, point towards tightening. If they end up you know, tightening a lot or even overreacting, then we could get negative drags on growth. One reason that I'm a little worried about this is because the survey data, the consumer survey data, is getting harder to read because it is so polarized. When you look at measures of consumer sentiment or inflation expectations, they're extremely divided on partisan lines. So right now, Republicans have strong sentiment, lower inflation expectations. Democrats, it's the opposite. And then that was reversed when Biden was president. It makes it really hard to say, have people's inflation expectations actually become unanchored, or are they just using the survey to signal how much they dislike the current administration? So I think if the Fed like over relies on these kinds of measures, especially when gas prices are high, then there's a risk of them over tightening in response to supply side shocks. Yeah, and it's possible also if the uncertainty continues and grows that we could have more of a drag on the demand side than we have yet. It's also possible that that just, you know, companies have prepared their inventories when the earlier tariffs were being planned. Now they've kind of run through that and they might eventually have to start passing more on to consumers.
And this is probably a great question to end things on. It comes from, we got two more questions. All right. So I'm going to save this one for last, but we'll get this one fast from Sanjay Supan. If we do end up being able to trace the administration tariff policy to wage or job losses, how can the link be made clear to workers? In a sense, how do you take this work that you're doing and make it accessible in a meaningful way to frankly the public that isn't necessarily as nuanced in the issues?
I want to, I guess, plug Riley's work here. I think whether or not tariffs benefit or harm workers, I think unions are a key mechanism for communicating that to workers, right? I mean, oftentimes I'm a member of a union in my workplace right now, and unions are a core way that workers talk to each other, learn about goings on in their industry, other workplaces, other units in their industry. So I think unions would play a crucial role in communicating that to the public and to their members with some detail too, right? Some firm level detail that might be unique to that union.
I would also quickly add, focusing on how the manner in which the tool has been rolled out impacts workers, and not the tool itself, because we have affiliates, unions who've been talking to members for decades about how tariffs can save their livelihoods in their communities. And so there are hundreds of thousands of workers where that's been the case. And so I think communicating how this is different is really important if folks are going to go that route.
Gotcha. So this is probably a good question to end it on. I hope I'm not butchering the pronunciation. Kiara Chinoy said, what kinds of questions would you like to see answered by research in the future?
I think we've been talking about the question that it comes up every time there are like ebbs and flows in trade policy, but it takes very careful academic research to be able to trace these policies to benefits and costs to workers and employers. And I think the more research there is in that space, the better, because those are the kinds of things, individual employers, individual workers and sectors, that are hard to see in the macro series and then hard to tie credibly to because of this policy. So I have no doubt that there's a flurry of academic research going on right now with all of the changes that have been going on. And I, for one, am mostly looking forward to what will take a little bit of time, but the end of the academic process in some sense, to see sort of what researchers are able to find out about the benefits and costs of these policies on businesses and workers.
Anyone else?
Sure, I guess two things is one is to understand how these policies relate to firms that export rather than sell into the domestic market.
Yep.
And also probably more difficult and perhaps next to impossible to understand, the various shares of these imports that come from firms that have offshored for labor or environmental or health and safety arbitrage reasons to sell back into the US market, which I think is a very different animal than some of the other imports we face.
Gotcha. Well, appreciate the time. We're kind of at it. Thanks to the panel, and just grateful that the Washington Center for Equitable Growth could put this together. Thanks.